Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, it certainly is a beautiful day in Texas. Yesterday, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, as I thought and pondered about a weekend, Memorial Day, suddenly it dawned on me that maybe we should talk about it. So I changed my sermon. So what you get is what you get. Memorial Day is a day in which we honor those who have fought in foreign wars. Many have died, and we've honored them for that. Many veterans became prisoners of war. They became missing in action. Others were killed in action. And so as time marched on since we began these wars in World War I and afterward, we have seen many people who have not returned home. No one knows what happened to them, or do they? Could it be that there has been a plan so that they would use many of our boys who have gone to fight and die to protect our freedom, that they are being used as pawns in a game? First of all, I would like for you to read on your own time or turn with me Leviticus 26, verse 13 to 16, the first phrase. And as I begin to read this, I'm going to interject another scripture to clarify who is doing the talking. I am the Lord your God, which brought you forth out of the land of Egypt. My insert is 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 1 to 4. It says, Moreover, I would not that you should be ignorant, how that all of our fathers were under the cloud and all passed through the sea and were all baptized unto Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And all did eat the same spiritual meat, and all did drink the same spiritual drink. For they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. So in Leviticus 26, verse 13 to 16, it is Jesus the Christ of Almighty God that made the statements, and Moses wrote them down. So I'll begin again now. In verse 13, I am the Lord your God, which brought you forth out of the land of Egypt, that you should not be their bondmen. Bondmen means slaves. And I have broken the hands of your yoke and made you go upright. And when you look that word upright in the Hebrew Strong's Concordance, it means free. He brought Israel out of bondage where they were slaves so that they could have freedom. But if you will not listen unto me and will not do all these commandments, and if you despise my statutes, or if your soul abhor my judgments, so that you will not do all my commandments, and that you break my covenant, I also will do this unto you. He proceeds throughout chapter 26 and a parallel book, Deuteronomy 28, telling of all the things that would happen to the people, Israel, and who they are in modern day if they did not obey their God. Notice what it says in Leviticus chapter 26, verse 25, the last phrase. You shall be delivered into the hand of the enemy. That is, if we disobey our God. When we look around today, we see major problems in every segment of society. We see the professing Christian world doing that which is right in their own eyes, rather than keep the commandments of God. They teach all kind of things that are the opposite of what the Bible says to justify disobedience. Then when you go to the average person on the street that has swallowed evolution, then you have no God at all. You have no morals. Therefore, once again, it's doing what is right in your own eyes. The Bible prophesied that this would happen in our day, but before I read that prophecy, I want to read something to you that every House of Representative member, every Senate member must take. It's called the oath of office. After the House Speaker and the Speaker in the Senate is selected, then he leads, and a voice saying yes of every member is required. Here's what they swear to or affirm to. Quote, I do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, that I take this obligation freely, without any mental reservations or purpose of evasion. In other words, they're not just saying it, but they mean it. And that I will faithfully and discharge the duties of the office on which I am about to enter, so help me God. They call upon God to hold them personally accountable for the oath upon which they have just taken. This oath is found in Article 6 of the Constitution, and the text is set by statute, 15 U.S. Code 3331. Now, I would like to turn to another scripture before I get into the meat of the message today. In 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 1 to 4. This know also that in the last days perilous or dangerous time shall come. For men shall be lovers of their own selves, covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, without natural affection, truce breakers, false accusers, incontinent, and that word means no self-control, fierce, despisers of those that are good. And look at the very next word. The Bible, the word of Jesus, the Christ of Almighty God, says traitors, heady, high-minded, lovers of pleasures more than the lovers of God. America has gone to war on many occasions during the 20th and the 21st centuries. An age-old slogan on the military field, and especially those who have been in the Marine Corps know this: we will not leave anyone behind. In other words, they will not leave anybody on the battlefield, but they will bring everybody home, or in enemy prison camps. The question becomes, is this slogan true? Has it been carried out? Does our military and federal government uphold it? I think it's very important for us to understand these things, to understand the government position right now. So we'll answer these things with absolute documentation. Many in Washington, D.C. have broken their oath of office and become traitors through the years. There was an article that was put out in the Dallas Morning News on Wednesday, September 18th, 1996. I'm going to quote parts of it. Dateline, Washington, D.C. Amid reports that the United States government was aware of hundreds of American servicemen left behind enemy lines after the Korean War, a high-ranking Czech defector said Tuesday that some of the Americans were subjected to Nazi-style medical torture during their captivity. Czech and Soviet Russian doctors, directed by Moscow, use hundreds of prisoners of war to test mind-altering drugs, chemical and biological weapons, and to sharpen their own medical skills, said Jan Sejna. He was a former Czech general and one of the top communist officials in that country. He now works for the Defense Intelligence Agency in Washington, D.C., and he gave this testimony before a House subcommittee. He went on to say that all of these were scientifically orchestrated against the American boys, prisoners of war. He said that he personally helped to ship them as human guinea pigs from the war zones to the Soviet Union. He had first-hand testimony of what happened to our prisoners of war and those labeled as missing in action. Mr. Sejna went on and alleged before this House Committee on Un-American Activities that American prisoners of war captured during the Vietnam War were made subjects of Soviet medical experiments. Whether the reports, according to this newspaper, were true or not is a matter of dispute because a certain amount of Mr. Sejna's testimony before the House National Security Subcommittee on Personnel, during these, both the CIA and the Pentagon have sought to discredit Mr. Sejna's allegations. The question is, why would they seek to discredit someone who was personally there and they knew they were there? The essence of Mr. Sejna's story, which was circulated inside the United States intelligence community for years, has been disclosed to the news media. This was in September 1996, and it came to the surface. It reignited a lot of the controversy over what happened to POWs and MIAs. Were they dead? Were they still being held in Korea or in Vietnam? Our government denies that they are. Mr. Sejna says they are still there, many of them, even though some have died. Since he defected in 1968 and began telling the story in the United States, Mr. Sejna's account has been criticized by a Senate committee, the CIA, and the Pentagon. He even went so far as to say some people have even called me a liar. Yet I was there and ordered the deportation to the Soviet Union for these human guinea pig experiments. Mr. Cass of the Pentagon's Defense of the POWs and MIA office said that Mr. Sejna's statements and his testimony were right on target according to all the information that has come to him, referring to American soldiers being used by the Soviet Union as medical experimentations during World War II. Naval Reserve Commander William G. Beck, another analyst from the Prisoner of War Office, said, and I quote, "Whatever the numbers, 200, 400, 900 or more, I believe the POWs were transferred to the Soviet Union from Korea. Then in Vietnam, POWs were transferred to the Soviet Union," end of quote. They say that all the facts verify it. Mr. Sejna was the star witness of this particular hearing, the subcommittee, and he brought to light a lot of declassified documents that they were denying. He even brought to light the fact that it was probably suggested in the papers from President Dwight David Eisenhower that he probably would not have entered into the peace talks with the North Koreans had he known officially that there were American prisoners of war still being held by the communists, but that information was suppressed to him. Estimates of the number of prisoners of war who remain behind vary widely. They're not sure. Retired Army Colonel Philip Corso, who happened to just be a military aide to President Eisenhower, also testified that he had heard of prisoners of war, as many as 500 sick and wounded Americans, that they were no more than 10 miles from the prisoner exchange location in Panmunjom, and they were never recovered, never exchanged by the North Koreans. So he knew that at least 500 were missing. The documents that were obtained by the subcommittee from Mr. Eisenhower's Presidential Library in Abilene, Kansas, and other sources said the United States knew that there were more than 900 United States servicemen who were never released by North Korea after the war had ended. That was just North Korea, not even counting World War II and World War I, when the Bolsheviks overthrew the Tsar of Russia, and they captured many Americans who were going into that area of the world to secure peace. Several members of the subcommittee accused our government agencies of failing to follow up on many, many leads, of which Mr. Sedgna's was just one. One of those representatives was Owen B. Pickett of Virginia. He was the subcommittee's ranking Democrat at that time. He said the United States government has not conducted the effective kind of effort that can fully account for these men. End of quote, and end of the article. This was distributed nationwide by the Knight Ridder Tribune wire service and picked up by the Dallas Morning News. But there was a very interesting report. It was an examination of the United States policy toward prisoners of war and missing in action by the United States Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, the Republican staff who in 1991 was the minority party. Just so happens, I have a copy of it. Every word of the report, and it's very damaging to the government of the United States. Former Senator Jesse Helms of North Carolina headed the committee to investigate this continuing problem with prisoners of war and missing in action. He wrote the introductory page to this report. As the minority staff, which the Republicans were at that time, they pursued its investigations as they went further and further. Documents came up, and it became clear that the United States experience in the Vietnam, with the Vietnam prisoners of war and missing in action, is not unique at all. It's been going on since World War I, the same type of program. Echoes of similar experiences in dealing with other and earlier communist regimes concerning POWs and MIAs kept coming up in documents released under the Freedom of Information Act, and they came up more frequent than any other source of information. An historical analysis of the fate of the United States prisoners of war and missing in actions that went into the hands of the Bolshevik regime after World War I, then the Soviet regime after World War II, and the North Korean regime, and then also the Vietnam regime, showed that the American government had not pursued. They had only talked about giving every effort in finding these boys and returning them home, but practically pursued none of the courses of action they laid down. In each case, the same scenario came up, wrote Senator Helms. On the communist side, he said, the regimes denied holding United States prisoners, contrary to many credible reports, people who saw them. They were eyewitnesses, that they were being held as slave laborers and as reserve bargaining chips to get diplomatic recognition for the new Bolshevik regime and also financial assistance from the United States. They wouldn't return the POWs and MIAs without getting concessions from our government before the release would take place. On the United States side, wrote Jesse Helms, Senator, our government downplayed or denied the reports of POWs and MIAs and failed to take adequate steps to prove or disprove the reports. Then here is the kicker. While elements in our government pursued policies intended to make diplomatic recognition and financial support of the revolutionary regimes possible. So the Soviets denied holding our people, but our own federal government within the State Department and other departments that deal with foreign relations were pursuing policies to diplomatically recognize Russia, a renegade communist country, as a legitimate government, and to transfer financial assets to them so that it would stabilize their government and keep it alive rather than fold up. He went on to say, why would elements in our government seek to give diplomatic recognition and financial support to these revolutionary communist regimes, whose ultimate intent is to overthrow our capitalist system for socialism, communism? End of his introductory statements. In a speech that was made in 1957 to the National Convention of the American Legion, J. Edgar Hoover, who was the director of the FBI, warned, and I quote, to dismiss lightly the existence of the subversive threat in the United States is to deliberately commit national suicide. In some quarters, we are doing exactly that, end of quote. That goes hand in glove with what Senator Jesse Helms found as late as 1991. And yet J. Edgar Hoover made that statement in 1957 that there were traitors in our government and that they were helping communism to succeed. On April 24th, 1920, right after World War I, the Joint Legislative Committee investigating seditious activities filed in the Senate of the State of New York a 4-volume report called the Lusk Report. The general introduction to Volume 1 states, and I quote, those representing the socialist point of view are the Socialist Party of America, the Communist Party of America, the Communist Labor Party, and the Socialist Labor Party. A study of their platforms and official pronouncements shows that they do not differ fundamentally in their objectives. Then they lay out the objectives. These objectives are the establishment of a cooperative commonwealth in place of the present form of government in the United States, the overthrow of what they are pleased to call the capitalist system, namely the present system under which we live, and the substitution in its place of collective ownership. In other words, the state owns everything, and the management of the means of production and distribution of the working class. End of quote. Pure communism. This was right after World War II. They had already started their infiltration before Russia was ever even a nation. Now you can understand that the United States is on the threshold of destruction. When statements of the Illuminati's leaders, and the Illuminati, it means illuminated ones. They are illuminated by Lucifer, the one who fell and rebelled against God. We call him Satan. The hierarchy of the Illuminati calls him Lucifer. But the lower level of the Illuminati, who are called Satanists, worship him as Satan. Just what the Bible says. But when some of these people, like Norman Thomas, who was a socialist, ran 6 times as candidate for the President of the United States on the Socialist Party ticket, here's what he said, quote, "The American people will never knowingly adopt socialism, but under the name of liberalism." What do we call certain congressmen today? Liberals. He said under the name liberalism, they will adopt every fragment of the socialist program until America will one day be a socialist nation without knowing how it happened. End of quote. If he were the only one, we might dismiss it. 3 months before his 1959 visit to the United States to speak before the United Nations, Nikita Khrushchev, who headed up as a ruthless dictator of international communism in Russia, he said this, quote, "We can't expect the American people to jump from capitalism to communism, but we can assist their elected leaders in giving them small doses of socialism until they awaken one day to find they have communism." End of quote. This has been going on for over 100 years in America. And you look around and you will find that all power has been concentrated in Washington, D.C. One of the major goals of international socialism and communism. Centralization of power in Washington has always been a prime communist, socialist, Illuminati objective. If the socialist communists can destroy the states' rights, the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, as an effective unit of government and centralize all power in Washington, D.C., they have only one battle to win: Washington. And as we've already seen, as far back as 1920, they already said in reports 4 volumes thick that they were already entrenched in our government. J. Edgar Hoover in 1957 said it. Senator Helms in his report on POWs and MIAs in his introductory statement said that there were those in Washington basically that were not loyal to America. So let's examine just for a moment the 10th Amendment to the United States Constitution. It states, and I'm quoting, "The power not delegated to the United States by the Constitution are reserved to the states respectively or to the people." End of quote. Nowhere in the Constitution does it give the federal government any power to control education, health, welfare, labor, dams and public power projects, agricultural, unemployment, or housing, and hundreds of more areas. Not once in the Constitution are they ever given. And yet the 10th Amendment says that they only can carry out those things which are delegated to them. Everything else remains within the jurisdiction of the state. According to the Constitution, the regulation of all unemployment, all these areas of jurisdiction should remain with the states or with the people. Remember the predictions of both a socialist and a communist, that they would pass legislation to socialize America without us even knowing how it happened. But you can now know why it doesn't matter which party controls the House or the Senate. There are sufficient people who have big money helping them to pass into office in Washington, to elect presidents like the Bilderbergers get together. These are billionaires, and they select who they want to become president of the United States. And they begin through their corporations to finance until they elect the person they have chosen. But we can know when federal funds are used to support education, which they're not given the right to do, health, welfare, labor, dams, public power projects, agriculture, unemployment and housing, and you could go on and on. The federal government uses control over every one of these areas in varying degrees and takes that control away from the states. Notice why the liberals, socialists, and the communists want the federal government to subsidize every area that they can possibly have them subsidize. The Supreme Court made a decision, Wickard versus Filburn in 1942, and it tells us everything. They left a statement in the decision, and here it is, quote, "It is hardly a lack of due process for government to regulate that which it subsidizes," end of quote. Every single dime that goes for some law to help education, they control it. Every dime that goes into housing, building housing projects, they control it, not the state. With each new federal law passed by Congress that invades the rights of the individual states, it further strengthens the control the government exercises over the citizens. What does this have to do with POWs and MIAs? Very simple. It shows there is an element that has already infiltrated the government of the United States, and it started over 100 years ago, to guarantee that our POWs and MIAs would be used as bargaining chips to transfer money to communist regimes to help stabilize them, to help them build a bigger war machine, so that they can one day perform that exactly what they said. They would take Eastern Europe and the masses of Asia. Then they would surround the United States, and it would fall like a ripe fruit into their hands. And they would use the soft underbelly of the United States, the Mexican border, to bring their people into the country. And this is exactly what is happening. An example of the individual states is that the Kennedy administration proposed the establishment of a new Department of Urban Affairs. The director would be an additional member of the president's cabinet. So the federal government would bypass the states and deal directly with the cities. And this is totally contrary to all precepts of the United States Constitution. Totally unconstitutional. So why would the Senate and the House of Representatives not veto it and stop it? Very simple. When you have more and more people who are liberals going in as representatives and senators, then you have more socialist communists to veto or to pass laws that will subvert America. The July 30th, 1953 report of the Jenner Committee is probably the most comprehensive of the congressional investigations undertaken by the Internal Senate Subcommittee of the United States Senate. The conclusions of that particular committee and that report are, number one, the Soviet International Organization. Remember, the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, Communist Russia, was nothing but a front for the Illuminati. The Illuminati were multi-billionaire international bankers, corporate giants, controllers of the economics of the world. And so they have had their organization, their apparatus, to infiltrate the United States. And they had successfully done it. And the report said they have had an important penetration of the United States government, and this penetration has not been fully exposed. That was in 1953. A second statement, conclusion they came to. This penetration has extended from the lower ranks to the top level policy and operating positions in our government. Did we hear what that said? Lower ranks to the top level policy and operating positions in our government. So why does Lou Dobbs run surveys on CNN? And 90 to 98% of the American people want one thing, but Congress does the opposite? Because it's been infiltrated from the lower ranks to the top level policy of operating positions in our government. A third observation that they saw, the agents of this penetration have operated in accordance with a distinct design fashioned by their Soviet superiors. And who are their superiors? The Illuminati. Not just the communists, not just the people that are head of Russia. Why was it that the Rockefellers could fly in unannounced to Russia? Because they're international bankers. Why was it the Rockefellers could establish at number 1 Red Square an international bank and no one else could? It's very simple. They have infiltrated. They're working for world government. There was an investigation into all of these nonprofit foundations. The Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Guggenheim Foundation, and on and on. Every one of them was declared subversive. They were funding operations which tended to destroy the Constitution. But a fourth observation that they wrote down, members of this conspiracy helped each other to get into government, helped each other to rise in government, and protected each other from exposure while in government. And the fifth one, in general, the communists who infiltrated our government worked behind the scenes. Well, what were they doing working behind the scenes instead of being out in public on television and interviewed? Here's what they were doing: guiding research, preparing memoranda on which basic American policies were set, such as we will not find the prisoners of war. We will not find missing in action. We will let them stay in communist prisons to be bargain chips, to be used to secure financial aid from the West before we would release them. And then it said they write speeches for cabinet officers. They influence congressional investigations. Is it no wonder that they could not find at least 15 Arabic individuals standing in front of the Murrah Federal Building, surrounding that truck that was driven up by Timothy McVeigh, and they got out of the truck with him? Because those who were influencing congressional investigations just happened to cause the tapes to disappear that they were on. Then it says they drafted laws. What were we told by both a communist and a socialist? That they would have liberals to introduce laws that would undermine the Constitution of the Bill of Rights, and one day we would wake up and have a socialist or communist country. Then this report says they manipulated administrative reorganization, always serving the interest of their Soviet advisors. Why do we have a Homeland Security now with all of these various departments all in one now? I have a book called Open Target, written by the man who headed up one of those organizations. And he left because he said now it's more inept than ever before. And the American people are more insecure today than when they founded the Homeland Security. It's called Open Target. You can look on the internet and find it for yourself and purchase it. It will scare you to death and stand your hair up on end as to what's really happening in our government. The sixth and last observation: policies and programs laid down by members of the Soviet conspiracy are still in effect within our government and constitute a continuing hazard to our national security. So subversion, infiltration, it's happening. That's why today's America is radically different than the America when I graduated from high school in 1959 at age 3. Fast learner. Mr. Frank Murphy was a Supreme Court justice. And all of a sudden he discovered that there was a plot to destroy the United States of America. Supreme Court Justice Murphy had a meeting with Congressman Martin Dies. Martin Dies happened to be the chairman of the House Committee on Un-American Activities. Murphy told Dies, and I'm quoting, "We're doomed. The communists have control completely. They've got control of Franklin Roosevelt and his wife as well." This is the early 40s. That was reported in the American Opinion magazine, February 1971, page 14. In 1949, 57 years ago from this taping, Mr. Murphy was to be released from a hospital, Detroit hospital, completely healed of an illness that he had. Suddenly, the government reported that he had a heart attack and died. Congressman Dies said that he believed to this very day, when he wrote a book exposing this, that he was murdered. James Forrestal He was America's first Secretary of Defense. He became very dismayed over the deliberate refusal of the United States to win World War II, 2 full years before the hostilities actually ended. The United States, by agreement with Roosevelt and Churchill of England, rearmed Russia with Lend-Lease war materials. This was all paid for by the American taxpayer. And then they waited idly by with a very few skirmishes here and there until Russia could march right into Berlin. Therefore, they captured all of Eastern Europe for international communism. What did V.I. Lenin say? He had a 3-pronged plan. Number 1, we will take Eastern Europe. The President of the United States and the British Prime Minister and Stalin signed the treaty that gave all those countries in Eastern Europe to Communist Russia. This so upset James Forrestal that he made a statement that was quoted, "These men are not incompetent or stupid. If they were merely stupid, they would occasionally make a mistake in our favor," end of quote. That was from the book, The Assassination of Joe McCarthy, by Medford Evans, page 113. Now, when you speak out as a government figure against the conspiracy for world government, you make enemies in very high places. Why? Because they've infiltrated from the lowest to the highest positions of policy making in our government. The following was recorded in the Congressional Record of the United States, December 6, 1950, page 16,179. Quote, "The communists, both American and European, had good reason to hate James Forrestal. He hated them. He emerged from the Second War dedicated to the destruction of communism. He had opposed every concession to bring Russia into the war against Japan. He fought General Marshall's effort to force Chiang Kai-shek to coalesce with the Chinese communists. He battled those men in the State Department who tried to give the Mediterranean Sea to Russia." End of quote. So there were people in high places. He was not powerful enough to expose them. Forrestal knew the world of free enterprise was under siege. And he knew when he wrote a book called Meeting at Potsdam. It says, quote, "Forrestal was alarmed by what he took to be Roosevelt's trust in Stalin. Forrestal's nightmare was that capitalism itself was under siege all over the world. During the war, that's the Second War, World War, his personal files fattened alarmingly, filled with the names of journals and organizations and individuals who were under communist influence." End of quote. Have we been infiltrated? It's been a long time. Forrestal had discovered the insiders' plans, and he was in a position to expose them. He had told a friend, and I quote, "They're going to catch us unprepared. American soldiers will be dying in Korea in a year." End of quote. From the book Death of James Forrestal by Cornell Simpson, page 5. Within a year, we were fighting in Korea. Forrestal spoke and wrote many times since he was a Catholic to his Catholic priest. He wrote about communism and a threat of America to him. And Mr. Sheehy, who was his priest, said, quote, "Many, many times in his letters to me, James Forrestal wrote anxiously and fearfully and bitterly of the enormous harm that had been done and was increasingly being done by men in high office in the United States government. He was so convinced they were communists or under communist influence, and who he said were shaping the policies of the United States government to aid communist Russia and harm the United States." End of quote. It's been going a long time, and these are the people who have shaped the policy that Jesse Helms wrote about, that our POWs and our MIAs would literally be used as pawns to get communist achievements done. About this time, a freshman senator came on the scene. His name was Joseph McCarthy from Wisconsin. It was James Forrestal who personally took this freshman senator aside and told him about the communist Illuminati menace and named names to him of key persons in our federal government who were consistently shaping our policies and programs to benefit Soviet Russia. On June 10th, 1947, a memorandum was sent from the Senate Committee on Appropriations to Secretary of State George C. Marshall. Now, Marshall was a general who had helped to withhold the knowledge of the Japanese plan to bomb Pearl Harbor that would take the United States government into World War II. He was also partially responsible for our military not winning in Europe by stalling for 2 years until the Russians could come right in and take Eastern Europe, just like V.I. Lenin said. Then all of a sudden, the second step of V.I. Lenin's program was to take all the masses of Asia. So all of a sudden, General Marshall turned up in China, and he cut off all supplies to the military equipment to our ally, Chiang Kai-shek. Therefore, they had to flee to Formosa, the island of Formosa, and the communists came down and took all of China. This memo that came out said, quote, "On file in the department is a copy of a preliminary report of the FBI on Soviet espionage activities in the United States, which involves a large number of State Department employees, some in high official positions. There is a deliberate, calculated program carried out, not only to protect communist personnel in high places, but to reduce security and intelligence protection to a nullity." So they wanted to get rid of all intelligence about this infiltration. They wanted to reduce all security so that they would not be exposed. Then he went on to say, should this case break before the State Department acts, it'll be a national disgrace, end of quote. Unfortunately, General Marshall failed to act. Why? It's obvious from all of his activities, he was a part of the plan. He was a part of the cover-up. He was a part of those who expanded international socialism all over the world. McCarthy went to work against these people who were determined to destroy America and turn it into the Soviet Republic of the United States. Concerning George C. Marshall's plan to act, McCarthy said, quote, "If he was wholeheartedly serving the cause of the United States," in other words, he was loyal to America, "these decisions were great blunders. if they follow a secret pattern to which we do not as yet have the key, they may very well have been successful to the highest degree. End of quote. That was from a book, America's Retreat from Victory, by Senator Joseph McCarthy, page 37. Just like today, on the Mexican border, why is it that nothing can get done to stop illegal aliens coming into America? These people aren't stupid, but if there is a secret program that the American people and Congress is not to know about, they may be having great success in taking the Southwest from America. Just after Thanksgiving of 1949, Joseph McCarthy had 3 visitors who came to his office. They showed the senator a 100-page summary of communist subversion in the United States. This included serious penetration of the State Department. The report had been prepared under the direction of J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI. A copy had already been sent to the White House. A copy went to the Secretary of State. First big mistake, since he was a part of the problem. Then it went to the heads of federal government departments. It detailed the operations of spy networks operating in the United States government and involving a large number of State Department employees, some very high in government. Senator McCarthy read the report and was absolutely shocked, as any American who has an open mind, and wondered, why aren't things going the way they should? And so he determined that day in 1949 that he would do something about it. It didn't matter what it cost him. He wanted to do everything he could to save America from communism. Joseph McCarthy saw a giant conspiracy. Why wouldn't high officials in the State Department and the Secretary of State, George C. Marshall, reveal the concentration of communists if they were not a part of the conspiracy? Those were his thoughts. The State Department conducts the official policy of the United States with foreign nations. Could our State Department have been taken over by communists to aid in the overthrow of non-communist governments? It happened in Cuba. It happened in the Union of South Africa. It happened in the Philippines. There are too numerous countries that our State Department used its influence to help overthrow a foreign government to even begin to name. But what about the POWs and the MIAs? McCarthy also told the American public that it was at the Yalta Conference in 1949 that Roosevelt and Stalin planned not only the Korean War that the United States was then involved, but also the Vietnamese War that was to follow, and he said it would come within 10 to 12 years. It was on September the 23rd, 1950, that McCarthy charged, and I quote, "Here at Yalta was signed the death warrant of the young men who were dying today in the hills and valleys of Korea. Here was signed the death warrant of the young men who will die tomorrow." That was yet 10 to 12 years away. "In the jungles of Indochina." End of quote. So he wrote that 10 to 12 years, stated it. It was on the record. Before it ever happened, he knew, because there had been communist infiltration into our government to plan it. McCarthy saw a deliberate conspiracy to send Americans to die in foreign lands and no-win wars, to break the will to protect the world against Illuminism, socialism, communism. They would not return the prisoners of war, the missing in action that was a part of the program to psychologically destroy the minds of the military of America. The plot was to make America, the American military, look weak and incapable of winning, and that the communists were unstoppable. Men in our own State Department were directing this plan. It was being concealed by the Secretary of State and others in high positions. Remember, the United Nations had been founded in 1945 by communists in our State Department. Alger Hiss was convicted and went to jail. He and a communist from Russia wrote the charter for the United Nations. Our Secretary of State had guaranteed the Russian communists that they would always be in charge of the United Nations military peacekeeping forces. With communists leading the North Korean War, and later the Vietnamese War, and the United States military having to report every movement of their troops to a communist at the United Nations for approval, no wonder we couldn't win in Asia. The prisoners of war, the missing in action, were to become the pawns in the political tug of war and used as medical experiments, guinea pigs, and for bribery purposes to get aid from the West. McCarthy wrote, and I quote from his book, McCarthy and His Enemies. This is by Mr. William F. Buckley. How can we account for our present situation unless we believe that men high in government are concentrating to deliver us to disaster? This must be the product of a great conspiracy, a conspiracy on a scale so immense as to dwarf any previous such venture in the history of man. A conspiracy so black that when it is finally exposed, its principles, that's the communist leaders, shall be forever deserving of speaking evil of all honest men. End of quote. And then in the book, Fear of Conspiracy, page 4, it quoted this: "What can be made of this unbroken series of decisions and acts contributing to the strategy of defeat? They cannot be attributed to incompetency. The laws of probability would dictate that part of the decisions would serve this country's interest." End of quote. It never did, though. On July 30th, 1953, the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee published a report that proved Senator McCarthy to be accurate in every one of his accusations. The report was entitled "Interlocking Subversion in Government Departments." I'll just quote a few lines from that text. Quote, "The Soviet International Organization has carried on a successful and important penetration of the United States government, and this penetration has not been fully exposed. This penetration has extended from the lower ranks to the top level policy and operating positions in our government. Despite the fact that the Federal Bureau of Investigation and other security agencies had reported extensive information about this communist penetration, little was done by the executive branch to interrupt the Soviet operatives in their ascent in government." End of quote. Why have you never read any reports concerning communist penetration into our government since the early 1960s. W. Cleon Skousen, who happened to be the assistant to director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, discovered the Communist Plan 45-point program for subversion of America. One of those was to eliminate the House Committee on Un-American Activities. They have. Our Supreme Court declared communism or socialism to be a political party and could not be touched. So they have free access today. Skousen condensed his findings of these communist objectives to 45 points. Point number 33 states, and I quote, "Eliminate all laws or procedures which would interfere with the operation of the communist apparatus," end of quote. By that Supreme Court decision declaring them a political party and freedom to exercise their political views, America has been in danger ever since. Point number 34 of those 35 were, quote, "discredit and eventually dismantle the FBI," end of quote. It has been discredited but not dismantled. Point 35, quote, "eliminate the House Committee on Un-American Activities," end of quote. This means our ability to defend ourselves from infiltration would be gone. Senator Joseph McCarthy had uncovered a giant conspiracy that had taken over the State Department and other branches of government. He had a list of 81 people who were security risk in this one department. But notice the results of McCarthy's investigation. Number one, 57 of these cases were later summoned by a loyalty board, and 54 of the accused confirmed McCarthy's charges by resigning under fire. Number two, by November of 1954, all of the 81 persons on McCarthy's list had left government employ by dismissal or resignation. Number three, the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee revealed that on June 27, 1956, the State Department's own security chief, Scott McLeod, drew up a list, not 81, but of 847 security risks in the State Department, end of quote. So McCarthy didn't even understand the gigantic conspiracy, even though he thought it was the greatest conspiracy in the history of the world. He did not understand it. Senator Joseph McCarthy paid with his reputation and his life for exposing this great conspiracy. He was a great American. In the book McCarthy, or the article McCarthy in American Opinion Magazine, page 9, here's what he said. There was a man by the name of Louis Budnez, a former member of the Communist Party. Here's what he said about Senator McCarthy. The destruction of Joseph McCarthy leaves the way open to intimidate any person of consequence. In other words, any congressman or senator, representative, who moves against the conspiracy. The communists made him a symbol to remind political leaders in America not to harm the conspiracy or its world conquest designs. End of quote. No wonder every president goes along with America's destruction. The communists said they would use the soft underbelly of the United States to destroy us. What is President Bush and Congress doing but allowing illegal Mexicans, illegal foreigners to come across the Mexican border? millions of illegal aliens through the soft underbelly of the United States. And on national TV, I nearly laughed my head off. There was a report on CNN said, "Oh, but there's nothing wrong with our border. We caught one of the Arabs coming into this country." One. But how many millions of others that are communist? Why are they allowing all the marches in the streets of America? Well, Lou Dobbs exposed it when they gave a background of every single one of those leaders. He said they were far leftist, which means in a politically correct situation, they're called leftists. But in plain language, it's communist. For those who are not interested in being politically correct. This leaves the Southwest open to anyone that wants to come in. And when the Council on Foreign Relations, task paper number 53, says we're going to build a North American European Union, Mexico and America and Canada will all be one continent, open borders. It's all for business purposes. They're not even a part of the government. They haven't been elected by anyone. But they are appointed, and they are political groups that have their own desires, and they have the contacts inside government to get these things passed. A Dr. Medford Evans concluded that it was not the communists who had actually silenced Senator McCarthy. He said that it was the American establishment. And if you didn't know, for the first time, the word establishment is now in Webster's dictionary. And it says that it's an Eastern group who are trying to run government for their own purposes. But Senator McCarthy did not even once attack the Eastern establishment. He strictly called communists who they were. And yet it was the Eastern establishment using their media, television, that destroyed Senator McCarthy. It was the Eastern establishment of Wall Street, the Federal Reserve, international bankers, corporations that wanted to be multinational and deal across every border in the world. They are the ones that destroyed Senator McCarthy. Now I want to give you an off the record and on the record statements by the federal government about POWs and missing in actions. The minority party in 1991 was Republicans. They continued to investigate the prisoner of war, missing in action problem. On the record, they wrote in their book, the United States government has professed to give these concerns the highest national priority. Then they stated, off the record, the POW MIA issues priority vanishes. Instead, other considerations have emerged. Now, this is Senator Helms. Here's what has emerged. Grand visions of a foreign policy of peace and reconciliation. Desire for a new economic order of trade and investment. Downplay the hostility of antagonistic systems such as communism versus capitalism. And the tendency of bureaucracy in Washington, D.C. to eliminate its workload by filing cases as closed, instead of actually pursuing the finding of the POWs and MIAs. In October of 1990, this minority staff published an interim report with hundreds of interviews The interim report suggested that the Department of Defense was more interested in manipulating and managing the issue of the POWs than finding them. As the investigation proceeded, according to Jesse Helms, the weight of evidence showed the absolute failure of the United States government to meet its sacred trust of bringing the POWs home. And they said the evidence was overwhelming. Was it really that officials in the executive branch charged with the solution of POWs and MIA's issues that have failed so miserably? Do the American people really believe it was just them? After everything that I've reported today, we know that it was not just the highest office in the land. No, just remember the Senate subcommittee reports from the 1950s and 60s stated that communist infiltration had gone to the very top positions of the executive branch. These infiltrators could be 33rd degree Freemasons, hand-selected by the Illuminati to know the secrets. Or it could be members of Skull and Bones, which is one of the Illuminati side orders. It could also be members of the Council on Foreign Relations. It could be the Trilateral Commission or the Bohemian Grove, where they worship Lucifer. Or it could be the Bilderbergers. All of these organizations are working as networks in creating a one-world government, and they must destroy the influence of America by allowing POWs and MIAs to remain unfound. Many soldiers have been listed as prisoner of war. They've been listed as missing in action, or they've been listed as killed in action by the Department of Defense because they use technical distinctions. This will avoid the POW-MIA problem, and they can deny it. Fellow soldiers have actually seen enemies taking their fellow soldiers captive, but they were too far away to get a clear look at their face. So rather than the recording of them as a POW or MIA, the Department of Defense, according to Senator Helms and the Republican Party's investigation, label them killed in action. That way they would not have to go find them. There have been many occasions where these individuals have been released, and it shocked people everywhere because they were listed as dead, killed in action. They were not listed as POWs or MIAs. Communists, starting with World War I, have used American POWs and MIAs as bargaining tools so they could get around international law. I'll just give one example. In 1973, the Vietnamese used prisoners of war in an attempt to blackmail the United States into providing $5 billion in what they call reparations. Both the United States and Vietnam asserted that the Operation Homecoming, and this is what they titled it, brought every soldier, every prisoner home. The Vietnamese believed that they had a deal so that they could use these prisoners in exchange for cold cash by not turning them over in the program Operation Homecoming. It was a deal that was brokered by Secretary of State Henry Kissinger by a secret hand-carried letter. And it was perfectly consistent with a historical communist policy that they would hold back prisoners against their will and even the remains of the dead in exchange for dollars at a later time. What most people don't realize, though, is that Henry Kissinger, who happened to be the Secretary of State back in those days, was a double agent. His code name was Bohr. He was identified by defectors from the communists and said they knew that he was a communist. And yet he held the office of Secretary of State. And as I close today, I want to mention a newspaper article that is very disturbing. The May 14th, 2006, Dallas Morning News had a headline, quote, "Mentally distressed GIs kept in Iraq," end of quote. I'll just mention a couple of lines of that article. U.S. military troops with severe psychological problems have been sent to Iraq or kept in combat, even when superiors have been aware of signs of mental illness. And this was reported in a Hartford, Connecticut newspaper. The paper cites records obtained under the Freedom of Information Act and more than 100 interviews with families and military personnel, reporting numerous cases in which the military failed to follow its own regulations in screening, treating, and evacuating mentally unfit troops from Iraq. As a result, 22 U.S. troops committed suicide in Iraq in the year 2005. Sometimes the truth hurts. We were declared a Christian nation September 29th, 1892 in a 9-0 decision of the Supreme Court. Just because a nation is declared Christian does not necessarily mean they live it from the heart. We have been infiltrated, and the federal government gives only lip service as a direct result to our POWs and MIAs. It's also a very shameful thing that mentally ill soldiers are required to remain in combat duty. But one of the signs leading up to the second coming of Jesus Christ and the founding of the kingdom of God is found in Matthew 24, verse 6 and 7. "And you shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you be not troubled. For all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom." We know wars are going to continue. They're not going to stop just because God opens our eyes. Sometimes by having our eyes open, the truth can hurt all the way to the heart. Jesus Christ told us and taught us to pray. And one statement that he made that every single one of us need to do daily. Repeat the statement in our own words from the heart. Is found in Matthew 6, verse 10, where Jesus told his disciples to pray, "Your kingdom come." We need that kingdom to come because of the atrocities that are happening in the world today. Human beings have feelings. They have nerve endings. They love. They hate. And so it is, our government has betrayed us in so many, many ways. and yet they pretend that they haven't. That's why we need Jesus Christ to return to this earth to bring about the prophesied time of peace and happiness, the gospel called the good news of the coming kingdom of God. And so right now, as I finish this message, I will say, Father, send your Son, Jesus Christ, so that your kingdom will come.